Hello and welcome to Property Question Time, the show where you get to bombard our expert panel of property experts with all of your questions. I'm Lucia France, and joining me in the studio today we have Joanna Legget, founding director of Legget Immobilier. We also have Steven Galpin, property consultant extraordinaire, and joining us from Australia we have Paul Mahoney. So first question over to you, Joanna. This is from some people looking to emigrate and move around the world. So hello, we are moving from Canada to France next year. Are there any specific considerations when moving to France from outside the EU or the UK that we should know about?
Well, it would be like moving to any sort of country in Europe. You would need to, if you're moving permanently, you would need to get a Carte Du Jour, which is like a work permit, to enable you to be able to work in the country. And to be able to get that along with a visa, you would need to prove that you can either support yourselves if you're not going to be working and show that you have enough income so that you're not relying on the state to support you, or you can apply for a Carte Du Jour, which is what we used to do as Brits before Europe. And may have to do again after Brexit. But it's quite a simple process, and as long as you can prove that you can support yourselves, it's not that difficult to be able to do. If you're looking at not living there permanently, you are allowed to stay in France up to 182 days.
Oh, okay. So that's longer than in some other countries.
As a visa, yeah. If you had owned a property in France, which I'm presuming that's what they're looking at doing, you would be allowed to use it up to 182 days.
Okay, and
as a non-resident.
Right, as a non-resident,
yeah.
So, but still owning a property there.
Yes.
Right, okay. And is there any other things that they should think about that are going to be vastly different from the laws in Canada in terms of buying a property in France and things like that?
Well, the property process in France is quite straightforward. I'm not aware of how the process works in Canada, so I can't quite compare to that. But in France, you'd find the property that you want. You would then put in an offer. If that offer is accepted, then the vendors and the buyers put together the compromis de vente. That can be done within a few days, providing all the paperwork is there. Then the buyers would sign first, then the vendors would sign. Then a registered letter goes out to both the buyers and the sellers. And then after 10 days, you would need to pay a deposit, which is usually around 10%. And then after that, it probably takes about 3 months in France for it to actually complete. And that's where all the searches are done on the property to make sure there's nothing that's going to affect the sale as such. So it's a very straightforward process. And for a buyer, you're protected. Once the vendor has signed, and that could be after 3 days of receiving the offer, they can't sell it to anyone else. They're then tied in. If they do, they'd be liable for 10% when they go to sell it to the buyer. Whereas the buyer can put in suspensive clauses. They have a 10-day cooling off period, but they could also put in suspensive clauses like for swimming pools or, for works to be done or change of use from an outbuilding. And providing they're all met, then the sale would go through. But if one of them isn't met, then they can withdraw from the sale and get their 10% deposit back.
Right. Okay,
so it's very, very good for the buyer. If they decided, after 10 days or after 2 months, we just don't want to buy it, they'll lose their deposit. Right. So then the deposit would go back to the buyer. So there has to be a good reason why they're pulling out. Yeah,
so it's sort of in the buyer's favour quite a lot of the time. Right, okay. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you. Now over to you, Stephen. Question for you is, somebody has trees on council-owned land which have never been trimmed or lopped in 40 years. They are now 60 to 70 feet high, and if they were to come down, they could cause extensive damage to my garden and buildings. I've reported to the council, but they say no work is needed. They are not subject to a preservation order, and I think they're not in a conservation area. Whilst I've had overhanging branches cut back over the years, can I have the trees reduced in height by a tree surgeon at my own expense?
Right, simple answer to that is no, you can't. Let's take it step by step. First of all, we've got these trees, they're of a height, 60 to 70 feet. The viewer is saying, well, if they came down, they could cause extensive damage to my garden. Unfortunately, that's the wrong approach, really. Obviously, the council's tree expert, whether that's an in-house person, possibly somebody from the Parks Department, or whether it's an outside consultant, have obviously been consulted here, and they say, no, the trees are safe. If the trees are safe, there's very little you can do about height. The only opportunity you may have is the argument about right to light. But usually there are two conditions for that. One is that you'll have to show that you've had 20 years uninterrupted light, before you can run that argument, and I doubt if that's the case. Possibly if you were there before the trees were, and again, it doesn't sound likely that that they were.
Right, yeah.
So I think a right to light argument would be quite hard to run, and the final point about that is usually you'd have to demonstrate that there are 2 or 3 trees in a line to create a serious light problem. Right, we've had the trees cut back and the branches which are interfering onto the viewer's land cut back. That's normal, that's quite right. You do have the right to cut overhanging branches off. You must return them to whoever owns them, and so you chuck them back over the fence. That's fairly straightforward. I think the approach here would be to go and see the council, not necessarily to say, can I have the work done, even if it's at my expense, but offer to subsidise the council doing the work. I think there's a subtle difference there. You'll find that councils are fairly inflexible because they're a public body having to respond to rules and regulations that are pretty well set down in stone. So to take arbitrary decisions about cutting trees down because you think they might in the future be dangerous, it's not really a runner. But if you were to say, look, I am concerned, they have got excessively high, I am prepared to underwrite the council's costs in doing this, I think you may find the council quite sort of cooperative. But it's not a question of right, it's a question of negotiation and asking for assistance, really.
And where you're talking about the right to light sort of argument, I mean, could you explain a little bit more about that? Because they have been blocking the light for 20
well, essentially, whether it be a building that goes up near to your property or fences or whatever else, you have a right to light that lights up your property.
So it's unobstructed light.
Unobstructed light. So therefore, if something comes along that does obstruct that, you do have an argument, but you have to demonstrate that you've had 20 years uninterrupted use of that light.
Right.
So that's quite a hard test to follow,
it must be very difficult.
especially where we're dealing with new buildings these days. You know, not many people have got that 20 years. And then in the case of trees, they'll tend to look at whether there is a line of trees blocking that site. I mean, the Leylandii trees that grow very, very quickly, there are specific regulations about how they may or may not be planted, because they tend to be used to create bushes and hedges that divide borders, and they are restricted in height. But simple trees, no.
And obviously here the worry is that they could cause damage to the garden and property if there was, you know, high winds or something like that. So is there anything they can go down that route on?
I don't think so. I think the council's experts will have looked at that. They'll have done a sort of damage limitation exercise on those trees. They'll have looked at the potential problems. They'll have statistics about the level of wind and storms in that area. They'll have done fairly serious calculations, and if they say it's safe, well, I think you're entitled to rely on that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Stephen. And then to Paul in Australia, a question for Paul is, my elderly parents really need to downsize their house to release some capital to assist with their pensions and also to live in a more manageable property. This process will be traumatic for a number of reasons. They're not going to handle the sell-buy process very well, so it would be great if there was a better way to reduce the pressure on the move. The house is worth around $285k and there is no mortgage. They would like to downsize to a smaller property, and it looks like something suitable could be found for around $230k-ish. After costs, that would leave a sizable chunk of money to live on. Could a buy-to-let mortgage be used on their existing home to release capital to go and buy a new home? The existing house would be sold as soon as possible after they were in the new home, and I realise there would be costs incurred for closing that off. So, Paul, what's your answer to that?
Okay. So there's a couple of different options and things you could look at here. I understand the buying and selling process in the UK is a real headache. The government's working on improving that at the moment, but that will be a slow process, and who knows what the outcome of that will be. So we've got a property of $285,000. Looking to downsize to a property of 230 odd thousand. So you've got about £50,000 there. Depending on your parents' living costs, I wouldn't say that's a very sizable chunk of money, especially after costs. So a few things you could look at. with the existing property, you could look at an equity release type product, or what's often referred to as a reverse mortgage, meaning that you're able to release equity from the property that your parents own, and they could use that to either to live off or to rent elsewhere, or potentially even buy elsewhere. But you need to look at what the purchase of the property elsewhere is going to be, because, you know, for example, whether it be an equity lease or whether it be, as you suggest, a buy-to-let mortgage on the property they currently own, they would then need to, I assume, take a mortgage on the property they're buying as well, which would be a residential mortgage and would be a lot more difficult to obtain than the buy-to-let mortgage. So some buy-to-let lenders will lend to people that are quite elderly. You know, some buy-to-let products will lend up to the age of 100, which, you know, surprises a lot of people. But the reason they'll do that is it's because the lender is assuming that there's rent coming in from the property they're lending on, and that is the serviceability for that buy-to-let product. That's very different for a residential mortgage, where the serviceability is the actual income of the person's living there. Now, I assume from what you've said, your parents are elderly and perhaps retired, perhaps they don't have any income, well, they might have a small pension, but I would be surprised if that was enough to get them a residential mortgage to then go and buy elsewhere. They could look at something like a bridging product, which is a short-term finance product. However, they tend to be quite expensive. You know, you'd be looking at the sort of range of sort of 0.5% to 2% a month of the loan amount. So depending on how long it's going to take your parents to sell their home, that could be quite a costly loan. It seems from the situation, just on the surface, and, you know, I don't have all the information, but it seems the idea of selling a property for 285, buying one for 230 odd, and having enough left over to live on is probably not something that's really going to work. And perhaps your parents may need to reassess their options as to whether they stay in the current property, or whether the downside property be a cheaper property to leave more of a buffer. And obviously the more of a buffer, the more options you have, because you can look at those more costly options and they not necessarily hurt your bottom line quite as much. As in anything, you know, generally with this show, seek professional advice. You know, the answer I've just given you is based upon very limited information. So what you should do is speak with a professional, provide them with all of the information. They can give you an idea of what the outcomes might be, what your options are, and then you can make the decision that works best for you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paul. We'll come back to you in the second half. That's all we've got time for this half. A little break, and then we'll be back very shortly.
The antiquated village of La Roche-Beaucourt in rural Dordogne may not have the cachet of Paris or London, yet it houses one of the 10 fastest growing property consultancies in Europe. It is home to Leggett Immobilier, the leading international estate agent in France. They have around 16,000 properties for sale right across the country, with a network of 400 agents who provide local expertise and market knowledge. If you want to know the best villages, schools, restaurants or boulangeries, then the Leggett team will know the answer. As well as advising buyers on the local market and regional property prices, they also have a bilingual contracts team who ensure that your purchase will go through as smoothly as possible. Leggett has been voted Best Estate Agent in France for the past 4 years running. To experience these exceptional service levels for yourself, then head to our website, leggetfrance.com.
Property is a great investment option, but it's one of the largest purchases that you'll ever make. As individuals, we're all limited by our resources, and regardless of our experience, knowledge or time, we can achieve much more with the help of a qualified team and extra resources being available. Nova Financial specialize in assisting clients to achieve financial freedom through property investment. With over 100 years of experience, we shape your family's future. To invest in property with absolute confidence, call us on 0203 8600 or visit nova.financial.
Welcome back to Property Question Time. I'm Lucia France and I'm joined in the studio by Joanna and Steven, and from Australia by Paul. Now we head back into our very first question to Joanna for you. The UK is too busy and noisy for us. We want to retire somewhere peaceful in France. Where should we go? And as a French property expert, this must be such a wide open question for you.
I think it is the never-ending question, yes, definitely. There's lots of things to consider. For example, if they're retiring and they want somewhere peaceful, I would also suggest you don't stay too far away from a major city for amenities like hospitals and things like that as well. But France is huge and it's the biggest country in Western Europe, so it changes depending on where you are. The things to consider would be the budget, because the budget changes depending on what area you're in, and also the climate, because the climate can vary. If you want, you know, the nice heat and the mild winters, then the south of France would be a good area for you. But the south of France, the southwest of France, has also got high temperatures that reach the same as they do in the Côte d'Azur, for example,
right, okay.
but a lot cheaper in prices. They have the Gulf Stream, but the winters can be slightly cooler there. If they're not looking for so much heat and they just want a nice rural location, they may want to move across to the centre of France, areas like Burgundy, for example, which is slightly cooler than the south and the southwest. Then you've got the Alps, the mountain ranges, if they're into, you know, walking or cycling, you know, mountaineering skiing, or something like that, exactly, skiing. Then you've got those areas, and they're also very good for investment, those areas, because they can rent out. If I would think from what the question is that they are looking for countryside. So as I said earlier, I'd always sort of find your town, find your transport links that you need to get backwards and forwards from the UK to see family and friends, and then pick a nice rural area depending on your budget from there.
And yeah, they do mention somewhere peaceful, so I think you're right in terms of countryside. Is there an area where you would say is kind of up and coming for that kind of thing, or?
Well, we have a lot of retirees coming to France. It's because of the lifestyle. The lifestyle in France is fantastic. In the countryside and rural locations, they will get that peaceful lifestyle. They'll be part of a small community. They will need to learn a little bit of French, because most of the French don't speak English unless you're in major cities, and peaceful locations aren't in major cities.
Yes.
But yeah, there's lots of areas. It really is down to the budget and the climate, I would say, you know, on where they should be. Brittany is a lovely area. Normandy, you know, Pas de Calais, if they want to be quite close to the UK, all have lovely rural communities where they would find the peaceful location that they're looking for. And the other great thing is that it's very little crime in the rural areas of France, in the countryside. So insurances and things like that for cars and house insurance are quite cheap, which is always good for retirees.
And if they were, I mean, they don't actually mention it in the question here, but if they were looking for, you know, having family come out and things like that and stay with them quite often, where are you going to get the most for your money in terms of size of the property?
Well, most from Normandy all the way down the southwest to the sort of South Languedoc areas, which is in the south of France. The Languedoc, you'd be looking at around 180,000 for an average house price. In the Charente, you'd be looking at about 110. In Brittany and Normandy, you'd be looking at around 120. But if you go down to the south of France, then you're going to be looking at over 300. The same with the Rhone Alps, you'd be looking at around 280 to 300.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Joanna. Moving on to Steven then, your next question for today. I recently left a private rental where it was quite clear the landlord had no intention of refunding my deposit. He had no deposit protection scheme, and not earning very much, I relied on that to settle the final month's rent. I arranged to repair some damage, and he restricted my access before my final day and now demands retention of the deposit and more. What can I do? Difficult situation here, right?
Well, it is, isn't it? But look, it's a little bit of time since I got directly involved in the rental market, but I'll endeavour to cut through the issues here. First of all, the first thing I'd say is that I'm not sure what the viewer means by a private rental. I'm presuming they mean a rental in the private market, and I'm also presuming that they did this rental without the benefit of an agent being involved. However, there will have been a lease signed, and I've long held the view that when two people sign a lease, the best course of action is just to do what it says. Right. You've signed the lease, do what you've promised. The landlord signed the lease, ask him to do what he's promised. Because in that lease, I have no doubt that it will deal with the treatment, the keeping and the protection of that deposit. Now, many years ago when I was involved in rental, I don't think the practice is quite so widespread now, but there used to be a clear distinction between a rental payment and a deposit payment. Usually they'd say, okay, you'll pay 1 month in advance and you'll pay a 5-week figure as the deposit. And the reason for that was that it becomes very clear what's a deposit and what's a rental payment. Now, what this viewer is attempting to do is to use that deposit as the final month's rent. Well, I think no. I don't think that's an acceptable situation. It does deny the landlord any security in terms of his dilapidations. So that's the first point. It's not correct to really try and do that. It says, I've arranged to repair some of the damage. Well, first of all, that damage needs to be assessed. The difference between damage and wear and tear. Wear and tear is acceptable, damage is not. Now, that again should be undertaken by a qualified inventory clerk who will do an inspection on the property at the last minute, prepare a schedule of dilapidations, and then that's agreed between the tenant and the landlord, and an appropriate amount is then deducted from the final retained deposit. Here, as I say, the tenant seems to be wanting to circumvent that by using the deposit as final rental, and as I've said, it's really not acceptable. The one fly in the ointment here is that they're saying that the landlord is denying them access prior to the termination of the tenancy. Well, that's not right. They have the right to enter that property freely and without interruption until the last day, irrespective really of any dispute that they've got. Again, the lease will be very, very clear on that. So I'm afraid this is going to just be an argument between landlord and tenant, probably not of enough value to go to law about. So as with a lot of advice that I give in these areas, it just needs good negotiating skills with the landlord, a good compromise, a little bit of flexibility on both sides, and get the matter resolved. But word of warning to other people, you know, this is a classic case. Use a proper agent, have a proper lease, have proper arrangements, and make sure that any deposit you pay over is protected in the first place. Worrying about it a year or 2 years later is not really the answer.
Yes, and it seems that there wasn't a deposit protection scheme in place here, and also that kind of both parties have sort of done something that's not quite right as well. So is there any other sort of recourse or action that the tenant could take, you know, to get a third party involved without having to go to the courts?
Well, I think the most sensible arrangement would be, as I'm sure the lease states, even if it's a lease that's been downloaded by the landlord from the internet, a sort of standard law society, a short hold lease, it's going to make reference to arbitration, and it's going to make reference to a qualified inventory clerk doing the dilapidations at the end of the tenancy. So I would remind the landlord of that, look at that clause, see what it does say in detail, and just remind him that you're both bound by the terms of that lease. Okay?
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay, and over to Paul in Australia. A question for you about renting out a flat. So, hello, for a couple of years I've been renting out my flat on a consent to lease. Every year I have to fill out a form saying that one day I intend to move back. If I decide to no longer do this and move to a buy-to-let mortgage, then what happens? Will I essentially be taking out an entirely new mortgage? Will I have to pay a load of fees? Are my monthly payments likely to be higher? Thanks in advance.
Okay, good question. And so you're currently on a consent to let. As you say, you need to continue that. There does need to be some sort of intent to move back at some point, and you're renewing it every year. If you were to, well, if you have decided that you're not going to move back there, if you were to decide that, then yes, you're right, you'd need to move on to a buy-to-let product. Whether there be any fees or whether the rates be higher associated with that change would really depend on your current lender and or the product that you were to remortgage to. For example, some lenders will make that process quite easy. They'll allow you to switch your product over from a residential to a buy-to-let. Those fees should be relatively minimal because you're staying with that lender, but not necessarily, because they are a different product. The other option would be to go and seek out a buy-to-let mortgage yourself, or speak with an advisor, an intermediary or financial advisor who can arrange an alternative product for you. And again, perhaps there would be fees and an increase in rates, but perhaps there wouldn't. It really depends what your current mortgage is as well. Your current mortgage might be outdated or at a higher rate than current market, or it might be old and at a much lower rate than current market. So without knowing that information, it's hard for me to tell you whether you're going to incur extra costs. But of course, there will be a change. Going from a residential mortgage to a buy-to-let mortgage, they are two different products. And as I say, if you've decided that you're no longer going to live there, then the right thing to do, the most correct thing to do would be to change over to a buy-to-let product. Without having to necessarily make that decision and incur those costs, you could go and speak with an advisor about what your options are. So that would be based upon your current financial position, the property itself, what you're planning to do with it all. And they would come back to you with a recommendation, which would usually include all of the costs that you would incur in implementing that recommendation. Most mortgage advisors will do that free of charge, or at least give you an indication free of charge of what your options are, so that then you can make a decision on whether you actually want to make that change. So I'd say that's probably your best course of action.
Thank you very much to Paul there. Now we've got a little bit of time for a golden nugget here today, and I believe Joanna has one for us, and it's about bringing vehicles from the UK into France. So Joanna, what's your golden nugget today?
Well, it was just a quick little tip. If you're moving to France permanently and you want to bring your car over, it's pretty straightforward, but you would need to register it in France and have the number plates changed to French number plates. Otherwise, you can have it insured up to 6 months in France, but after that, if it's not on French plates, you can't insure it in France. However, I did find out recently that bringing a van into France is much more complicated than that, and you do need quite a lot of documents, including where it was built, etc., because it's classed as a commercial vehicle. So if you are looking at moving permanently and you are bringing a van or a car's quite straightforward, but do look into the ins and outs of bringing over a van.
Okay, and do you know what the reasons are for that? Is it just because they'd rather that you bought the car or the van rather in France?
No, I think it's because they class it as a commercial vehicle, so there's
Right.
lots more rules and regulations put towards it. I mean, if you've bought a holiday home and you're coming backwards and forwards, then your car or your van will be insured in the UK.
Yes.
So that's not a problem at all. It's only really for permanent residents as such.
Yeah, because I think it's normally 90 days in Europe or something like that. So if it's a holiday home, that's a
Of
different
course,
matter.
yeah.
But definitely if you're looking to be a resident.
Yes, do look into the ins and outs of bringing commercial vehicles over.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for that fantastic golden nugget of advice there. Thank you to Joanna Legget, Steven Galpin, also Paul Mahoney in Australia. And of course, we'll be back again with more of your questions and answers for them from our selection of property experts. info@propertytelevision.tv is the best way to get in touch with your questions if you have anything you'd like to ask. And www.property-tv.co.uk is the website. We'll see you again next time here on Property Question Time.
Property is a great investment option, but it's one of the largest purchases that you'll ever make. As individuals, we're all limited by our resources, and regardless of our experience, knowledge or time, we can achieve much more with the help of a qualified team and extra resources being available. Nova Financial specialise in assisting clients to achieve financial freedom through property investment. With over 100 years of experience, we shape your family's future. To invest in property with absolute confidence, call us on 0203 8600 or visit nova.financial.